materialism starts to emerge as well, maybe even in response to neo-evolutionism, that this was a way that we can look at the a society as having these same elements as Marx described, as having an infrastructure, that is to say technology, economics, demography, your structure, which is your social relations, your kinship and descent forms, and patterns of distribution and consumption. And then your superstructure, which is what Marx would call your ideology, which is religion, art, these sorts of things. And each of these arises from the other. And so in cultural materialism, infrastructure is essentially your means of production, your structure is your mode of production, and your superstructure is your ideology. Now, this may even now to your ears sound like we're becoming more scientific, and that's true. Science and determinism starts to filter into this, and this is not necessarily a good thing. There are people like Marvin Harris, who was a cultural materialist, who really did start to go down this road of insisting that anthropology was a science and that we could uncover direct causes and effects, and that that this became what we call deterministic, that we could reduce human behavior to almost mathematical laws, and we could describe people mathematically. Now, does that mean that that this is exactly wrong? No, we can pattern human behavior. But there's more to it than that. An individual can act against these patterns. So there's more nuance than simple science and determinism can give us. So this led to a conflict in anthropology between those that thought that there were deterministic models that we could model behavior, and then those that said no, it's chaos, that humans just behave chaotically. And this was butting up against one another, or maybe pulling in different directions. You had people like Leslie White, who established what he called culturology. And culturology described anthropology as a science. And this was where he saw that cultural forces were so powerful that individuals really didn't make very much difference in this. He disputed things like what was used as what's called the big man theory in anthropology, that one charismatic individual can change things. He said, no, that's actually a person coming up in a time and a place that actually the structural forces allowed that big man to establish themselves. So White's culturology was very much a deterministic model. Also, you have the sort of founding father of sociology, Emile Durkheim, who talked about the collective consciousness, or conscience collective. That this is where he saw that culture actually was not maybe even materialistic, or maybe it had to be expressed materially, but actually culture existed between people's brains. And he saw that identity formed as through the interaction between people, and but it also rose as a social structure. And Clifford Geertz, Victor Turner, and also Mary Douglas, they started to actually go in another direction. They started to think of symbolism, and that actually this was people were interpreting symbols and maybe even not conscious symbols like letters and words or pictures, but even things like tables and chairs and blinds and doors, all creates the cultural context in which you live. And you're entering that into your brain, and then that affects your output as well. And so when you speak and when you create and when you do things in your culture, you are first internalizing what you're observing, and then you are participating in that culture. And it's a constantly moving cycle. And so this brought us to this conflict between what's called structuralism and agency. And it really shouldn't be a conflict, but you have some leading lights. For instance, Claude Lévi-Strauss. Yes, the name is spelled just like the genes, but it's not the same person. Claude Lévi-Strauss, a very important French anthropologist, talked about universal structure, that humans had sort of a pre-programmed ideas in their brain, and you could see general patterns everywhere, and the structure was so patterned and so powerful. But you have others. The processual approach, processual anthropology, looked at agency. So individual participation is actually what builds that structure. And frankly, these are two sides of one coin. You have structure going into your brain, and then you have agency going out of that. You're not completely free. I'm not completely free. I didn't choose what culture I was born into. I was enculturated as a child to understand all of these symbols, all of this world around me, and how to speak and to participate in it. But how I do that is my own agency. I can actually choose to rebel. I can actually choose to reject the culture that I was grown up in. But I do so from the perspective of having that is the way that I do it. Is so my structure is telling me how to rebel against that structure. So there's no way you can really separate these two things. And I think perhaps one of the best ways to look at this is to simply accept that structuralism and agency are an interlocking set of factors. It's a constantly moving cycle of creation and interpretation and creation and interpretation and so on and so forth. All right, that's it for theory for today. There's a little bit more in your book, so take a look at that, and we'll move on to some of the different aspects of culture in the next lesson. Thank you.